welcome to the Telegraph's Daily Tea podcast live from the Conservative Party conference here in Birmingham. I'm joined by my colleague Tim Stanley, sketch writer and commentator, and Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg joins us on the stage today. Welcome, Sir Jacob. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. And welcome to you, the audience, as well, and to our subscribers who are watching, I'm sure, not only from all around the UK, but from all around the world. Such is the popularity of the new Daily Tea podcast. Sir Jacob, could I just kick off? You owe all these wonderful people here a bit of an apology, don't you? After 14 years of Conservative government, you didn't manage to give. People are standing at the back here. The government that they actually wanted, which would have been a Conservative government.
I think I'd start by giving them a word of thanks, because the people here today are the people who carried on working for the Conservative Party even as it was clear that we were losing, who were willing in the election campaign to deliver the leaflets, who stayed true to the Conservative Party in the face of great difficulties, and are here at this conference when we've lost, and lost badly. So I want to begin by thanking you, because you're the ones who wore through the shoe leather and have done so not just in the last election, but in many previous elections. And yes, an apology is due as well, that we were not a Conservative government, certainly not by the end of it. We did some Conservative things, but the size of the state grew in our 14 years. Now, there are explanations I can give for that. There was the coalition, there was a lack of majority, there was COVID. But we did not do the radical Conservative things that actually were needed to give growth to the economy.
Can I just, do you think that the issue was the Tories becoming, as Liz Truss said yesterday, socialist, or was it that they had good instincts, they got somehow sidetracked from doing the right thing?
There was a leak of a cabinet meeting, shocking thing, didn't come from me, I can tell you that much, where apparently the then Minister for Brexit Opportunities referred to the Socialist Chancellor. I obviously can't confirm until it comes out under the 30-year, now reduced to 20-year rule, whether this actually happened. But I was very concerned when we were doing things like putting up taxes, when we promised we hadn't. So we had admittedly we then cut national insurance, but we put national insurance up. That was a terrible thing to do. We put business taxes up, corporation tax. That was a stupid thing to do. I'm not sure it was socialist. I'm not sure my socialist comment was fair. I think it was blobism of ministers going into their departments and being taken in by the very seductive British establishment and then following the conventional thinking, which is conventionally wrong.
But, Sir Jacob, could there be another reason? I take that point, but the fact is you were in government for 14 years, that the public have demanded, particularly since COVID, a different settlement with the state, that they want more, and they imagine in some way that the state can provide it. And the Conservatives have failed to make the argument that the public finds satisfactory, that the state should do less and personal responsibility matters, that you've lost the intellectual debate in some way, and the public wants a different deal with the state now than they would have done in 1979.
I'm not convinced by that. I'm not convinced by government by opinion poll. During the lockdowns, I wasn't the greatest enthusiast for lockdowns, and I'm now delighted to see that so many people are saying that they weren't such a good idea after all. That was very much what I was arguing after the first lockdown, which I accepted. But the answer I was often given by people in government at the time was that lockdowns are very popular. They were getting 60, 70, 80% popularity ratings in the opinion polls. But you mustn't believe those sorts of opinion polls. They're basically nonsense. Ladies and gentlemen, if I ask you, are you a good person, which one of you is going to say that you are not? I mean, you're Tories and you're here, so you're obviously good people, so I'd have a 100% response rate to that. But people want to give the worthy answer. Look at all those opinion polls where people say, oh, I'd love to pay more tax. Then they get the tax bill, they hate it. And you've got to recognise that government by focus group, government by opinion poll doesn't work. You need government for what you believe in. Then you make the argument, then you put it through, and then you find it works, lo and behold. And then people vote for it. That's what Margaret Thatcher did. And I think we were much too seduced by government, by opinion poll and
Why were
focus
you
group.
so weak in that argument with the blob or the establishment, which obviously, if you're in government, you are, it's almost de facto part of the establishment, frankly, and Sir Jacob, many people would say, you are part of the establishment. Why were you not able to argue from Conservative principles, this was not the way you were going to do? This is how we're going to behave. Why was Rishi Sunak? Why was Boris Johnson? Why was Theresa May? Maybe not Liz Truss. She did something different. So unable to actually be in power.
Well, first of all, in terms of me being in the establishment, I was born into the establishment. When I was born, my father was editor of the Times. It's not much more establishment than that, even more establishment, dare I say, than Daily Telegraph. Shocking thought. And that's why I know how rotten the establishment is, because I've seen it for the whole of my life. And it is basically in the business of managing decline. And that is one of the worst things that has been true of the British establishment, really, in the post-war period. Why didn't we get a grip? Well, I think the real problem is actually the constitutional changes made by Tony Blair that took power away from ministers and gave it to other bodies, which we didn't reverse. Now, in the first 5 years, we couldn't reverse it because we had the incubus of the Lib Dems on our back, and they certainly weren't interested in doing it, and we were worse, actually. I mean, the David Cameron government implemented parts of the dreadful Equality Act, and the Equality Act then came back to bite ministers whenever they wanted to do anything. Have you done the equality evaluation to see whether this appointment is all right? You've got the independence of the Bank of England. And the Bank of England under Carney was scandalous and politicised, and under Bailey's simply been incompetent. The only person who got it right in the Bank of England was their chief economist, who they eased out. And they got it hopelessly wrong, completely failed on monetary policy, allowed inflation to run rampant, was slow to put interest rates up to the cost of living crisis, and are now slow to put them down. But that power was given away, actually a requirement of the Maastricht Treaty to give an independent Bank of England, and we didn't take it back. Now, we need to have a reformation of the Constitution back to where it was prior to Blair's vandalism, so that ministers can make choices and be accountable. Because the current system means that ministers suggest something and then they're told that they can't do it. I in my brief sojourn as Secretary of State for Energy, wanted to approve a power station on waste, because our waste goes off to Denmark or somewhere, and I thought, well, why don't we do it in the UK? The planning application was there, and I was told I couldn't approve it, because if I did, we would lose on judicial review, because the applicants had not considered properly, and this will upset you all greatly, the consequences to the common seal. Now, the thing about the common seal, it's not the top Tory toff seal, it's the common seal, because there are lots of them. There is no shortage of common seals, but could I approve this thing? All I could do was delay, in the hope that some minor alteration could be made to answer a few questions. But you are so hemmed in decision-making that stopped us, because we didn't do the fundamental thing, which we will need to do if we get back into government, which is actually to restore power to the democratic arm of the British state.
The question I keep asking all good, sound Conservatives who obviously share the instincts of the common man is, why then did you personally lose? Why didn't voters look at you and say, OK, I don't like the Conservative government, but I want you in the House because you stand up for what I believe in?
When Boris Johnson was facing defenestration, I made the point that people voted for a leader and for a party, and that it was treating the electorate contemptuously to change leader without a general election. People thought I was saying this just because I was on the side of Boris. It wasn't true. I think it is the way the Constitution is evolving. We have a presidential system in the way people vote, even if our constitutional system is a parliamentary one. I've always been aware that I win or lose in any seat that I stand in on the leader of the party and the party. The individual independent vote is tiny, and actually it mainly goes to about 5 Lib Dems. The other 70 don't get a personal vote. They win or lose on how popular Lib Dems are. And I think we need to understand that as to how our constitution works.
So it sounds like you're personally blaming the defeat on Rishi Sunak.
Well, I'm not personally blaming it
You said
on
a presidential
yes,
system.
I'm not entirely blaming it on him, because the party, through the idiocy of going through all those leaders, had got itself into a lunatic situation. That people didn't know what they were going to vote for. I mean, they thought vote for Rishi Sunak. Who might they have the day after? Yeah. We were changing our leaders in the way some people change their shirts. Actually, people here probably change their shirts much more often, but nonetheless, we were changing too often, and we treated the electorate with contempt. And Rishi must bear his responsibility for that, because he wanted to get rid of Boris, which was a really stupid thing to do. It was a terrible mistake, because when you knocked on doors in 2019, people said, not I'm voting for you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, I'm voting for Boris. In 2024, I think there were 2 nice people who said they were voting for Mr. Sunak.
Right.
But that was it, and I knocked on thousands of doors.
Right. Well, he's got a big family. Some of it must extend to Somerset. You were also lost because the centre-right vote was split in your constituency with Reform. And you've been very interesting on this subject. I feel the vibe of this conference is people would like, as Kemi said yesterday, to say Reform are not real Conservatives and are not sensible people. So they would like to just... They sort of feel as if Reform will go away if the Tories just get their act back together and are more perceived to be more right-wing and tough on immigration. Is that your analysis, or is there a different take that the Conservatives must have on Reform?
Reform voters are good, sensible people. I heard from people who came to help me in the election campaign that they'd gone into central office to help the telephone campaigning operation. And they'd rung people in Clacton. And they'd rung Tory members. And the Tory members were all voting for Nigel Farage. These aren't wild, silly people. They are good, solid British citizens who wanted to vote for a party that was going to do something they cared about. Reform got 4 million votes. Are we saying, as I think David Cameron said of them, that they're all Fruit Loops and Looney Tunes? I paraphrase. Well, if we are, we're stupid. Reform did not take our votes. We have no right to those 4 million votes. We have to win people over at every election, and Reform is a powerful reality. The idea that Nigel Farage, who is one of the most capable and charismatic campaigners in the country, is going to disappear in a puff of smoke from one of his Marlborough lights seems to me deeply improbable. He is a force to reckon with. And we know from the 1980s that a divided wing of politics not only loses, but loses heavily. We have to work out how to win those 4 million back. Now, there may be different strategies. It may be that you can do it by having a strong immigration policy. But why should anyone in the country, anyone, trust us on immigration after our appalling failure from 2010 to 2024? We promised tens of thousands in the 2010 manifesto, which we knew was a lie, actually, because we knew we had no control over EU migration at that point. It was, perhaps lie is harsh, lie is often too harsh. It was a deliberate attempt to point people in the wrong direction, because I think there was some small print pointing out free movement. I'm afraid we completely failed after COVID for explicable reasons, but not, I think, ones that voters are impressed by. And we had 1.4 million people net come in the 2 years to June 2023. Is there anyone in this room who trusts us on immigration? We can say the most wonderful things, and everyone thinks, well, actually, Nigel will do it properly, and we won't, because we failed before. So I don't think trying to steal back our clothes from Reform is likely to work, because I think people won't believe us. I think we therefore need to show that we are changing by recognising that Reform is real and trying to bring them into the tent. That may mean that some people leave the tent at the other direction. But that's something we must accept. We are, after all, the Conservative Party, not the Lib Dem Mark II party. And I don't want to be the Lib Dem Mark II party.
Now, so, Jacob, you've suggested... Well, actually, I just want to ask about the Kemi Badenoch point that you make, Tim. She said that she did correct herself slightly in the Q&A yesterday with Christopher Hope, when she said that Reform supporters weren't sensible or serious. She then said that the politicians weren't sensible or serious. Was that a mistake to say that about the politicians?
Look, I don't want to criticise the leadership candidates. not least because I think Kem is wonderfully charismatic and an exciting person within the Tory party fold. The risk to exciting people in the Tory party fold is that they make gaffes. But I don't hold that against them because politics is so boring if nobody ever makes a gaffe. I mean, many years ago, I'd only just been selected as a candidate. Helen and I in the audience were going home, and this great blonde creature was cycling along Park Street and hailed us from his bicycle. We discussed the fact that the two of us had created the two big gaffes at the party conference. And this had entertained everybody, because otherwise they're frightfully boring. We need politicians who say what they think. So I'm not going to criticise Kemi. And I want her to keep on saying interesting things. I think it'd be a real shame if the advisors got to her and made her stop saying interesting things. But I think to say that Nigel Farage is not a serious politician ignores the evidence. We would not have had Brexit without Nigel. Without the success he made of the UK Independence Party, of the Brexit Party, of pushing us down to our lowest share of the vote in 2019 in the European elections in our history, going back to Queen Anne, the worst result ever, we would not have got the referendum in the first place, which David Cameron offered to neutralise UKIP, to neutralise Nigel. We would not have won the referendum because we would not have appealed to the Labour voters who eventually came over to us, who Nigel appealed to, particularly the northern Labour voters. And we might still have Theresa May as... No, we couldn't possibly, could we? That's going a bit far. But he crystallised the opposition to Theresa May in that vote in 2019.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage is a fundamentally important political figure, and he hasn't done it just because he swigs beer and smokes fags. He's done it because he's actually a formidable political operator who has his finger on the pulse of what the British people think. Nobody talked about small boats before Nigel started reporting on it, and now everybody talks about small boats. So I just think it's a mistake to dismiss him.
So, Jacob, you're talking with much more passion about reform than you are about the Conservatives. Could you imagine you actually joining Reform?
No.
But they're doing what you want. You say they have this amazing, capable leader.
They're doing what most people in this room want.
Are you looking for coalition then, in some way?
I think you have to... Look, I had Richard Tice on my GB News programme last night discussing exactly this. And he said what we need is PR. And I said to him, and I'll reiterate this point, PR is the loser's choice, because you never win with PR. First past the post system is more democratic. It gets more of what people actually want, rather than the politicians stitching it up afterwards. But under first past the post, you have to have your wing of politics united. So yes, I actually first called for coalition with UKIP prior to the 2015 election, because I think we need to bring people of our broad view, the broad Tory family, together.
So coalition with Reform now would be the way forward for you?
Well, I think, look, I wouldn't do it tomorrow. I think we need the ardour to cool after the last election. We need to see what happens in the local elections. We need to see who our leader is. But before the next election, if the Tories and Reform are fighting every seat properly against each other, we will lose.
Right. If you had held your constituency and you were still in Parliament, would you have run for the leadership?
If ifs and ands were pots and pans, there'd be no need for tinkers, I think is the answer to that one.
Right. You know you'd win.
No, it's nonsense.
You would?
I wouldn't win.
You would? I'm
I
looking
think...
around. People are nodding.
Well, that's because they've come here to listen to me, and my wife's in the audience. Anyway, no. Look, I think we've got a fine spread of candidates.
Right.
I think any one of the four would make a respectable leader of the Conservative Party. I don't have a choice. I think they all have their different qualities, which I'll happily run through if you'd like me to. Well, but they are good people.
They are different. They are different. They are different.
And you have laid out what you think the Tories need to do. So the obvious question is, which candidate thus far has come closest to what you're saying the Tories need to do?
Well, they're in campaign mode, so they're all inevitably trying to say things that appeal to as many people as possible. I think we are talking much too much about immigration. and not enough about the economy and about net zero. They actually come together because net zero is bankrupting us. And if we carry on with a deficit of 5% and we dance in the streets when the OECD says we're going to get growth of 1%, that is the way to bankruptcy. Economic matters are fundamentally important, and net zero yesterday, we closed down Port Talbot and we closed down our last coal-fired power station. And we're now expecting a cold winter. Coal provided, even at the last moment, 2 to 3% of our daily need. We're risking heat and power during the winter, and we're closing down, shutting down jobs because our energy is twice the price of the United States. By example, it's 4 or 5 times the price of India and China. This is a crazy policy, and our emissions are negligible anyway. We need to be talking about that. And actually, I think that's the way to cooperating with reform, because reform is more outspoken on net zero than we've been.
Yeah.
But climate change matters, doesn't it?
Why?
The Conservative... Why?
Why?
Because a warming planet will create
So what difference are we going to make?
Well, I think that, I don't want to get wrong. I'm not here as a sort of spokesperson for climate change, but I'm just wondering, don't some Conservative supporters believe in their minds the protection of this green and pleasant land?
Marvellous.
I was speaking to the NFU president yesterday, who is a farmer himself, and he was saying that the increases in rainfall, the increases in extremes of weather were affecting the land and how we produce food. These things matter.
Even the IPCC admits that the evidence for extreme events being climate change related is not there, that the hurricanes and the typhoons are much the same as they have been in every other year, the forest fires are much the same as they've ever been. Look at the data on rainfall in this country, other than Somerset, where the climate's absolutely perfect, and we mainly have sunshine. It only rains at night, so the crops get fed, and I'm sure you know that. But we've had heavy rain. Look at the famines that we had in the 16th century when the rainfall either didn't come or came too heavily. Look at the 19th century and the effect on the price of corn and all that goes on with the corn laws that we have. Look at the cold period that we have around the death of Charles I, and that wonderful book by Geoffrey Parker linking the events of the mid-17th century, including the 30 Years' War and our Civil War, to the cold period that makes food harder to produce. We have had these variations in climate, which we have coped with. We may have global warming, which will lead to more variations in climate, and then we adapt. And we work out how we deal with what is happening. We may start growing more champagne in Sussex, and we may find that other bits of the world become more productive, others less productive. But if all of us switched off our central heating, sent our cars to the crushers, wore the same clothes for the next 30 years, it would not make a blind bit of difference to emissions. We're 1% of emissions. Now, we may historically have been responsible for more, but that's too late. We can't sort of suck back up the carbon dioxide pushed out by steam engines in 1852.
Yeah. Well, someone who shares that perspective is Donald Trump. There's going to be a vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. How closely are you following the American race, and what would you like to see happen?
Oh, I'm following the American race avidly. I'm fascinated by American politics, as I think a lot of Englishmen are. Their system is so interesting. I think the US Constitution and the UK Constitution are the two great constitutions in the world, but they have differing problems that you can't solve without swapping constitutions, that no constitution is perfect. Even if Somerset had had a constitution, I suppose that would have been perfect, but it never had an independent constitution. I will say in due course who I'm going to support. Not that it makes any difference.
In America?
In America.
In America.
And here?
Okay.
No, here I'm going to remain at least until we're down to two.
But I'm surprised you're holding back on America.
I'm holding back because I'm going to reel it exclusively to my viewers on GB News.
Right, okay. Okay. But I'd be surprised if it was Kamala. It might not be Trump, but I'd be surprised if it was Kamala Harris.
I think he was exclusively revealing who he's going to support in the UK.
No.
On GB News. For both.
For the US.
But I think American elections are absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
But interfering doesn't necessarily go well. I don't know if any of you remember when the Guardian had a campaign of writing to people in some county in Oregon to say, please vote, I think, against George Bush because he's such a bad man.
Yes.
Well, the vote for George Bush in this county in Oregon went shooting up. And think of when old Obama came to tell us we had to vote in favour of remaining in the European Union. That was one of the great days of the referendum campaign, as far as I was concerned. Everybody I knew thought it was an impertinence of some foreign politician to tell us how to vote. So when I do say how I'm going to support, I shall phrase it carefully, because I wouldn't want to annoy American voters if they took any notice, which is probably unrealistic.
Is there anything in particularly the J.D. Vance analysis of American politics where he's almost reaching over the political divide and talking about union rights, local jobs for local people, minimum wage, bringing back manufacturing, which is very aligned to the union narrative in America and also to the union narrative here. And that, Tim and I have discussed this on the podcast, seems quite smart for the right to be thinking about a different offer to working people in the UK.
I mean, it is very interesting how you've seen the right, both in the UK, particularly with Brexit, and in the US, change the demographic that is voting for it. So a lot of people who are relatively well-to-do and with degrees are voting left, and people who have worked on shop floors are voting right. And this ends up being about values, and it's partly about the culture wars, which are even more important in America than they are here. But if you find a lot of people who are voting for you who have your values in one area, but economically look to a different approach, what do you do? I think that is going to be a challenge for the Conservative Party here and for reform, particularly if we do manage to do something with reform. Because I'm personally convinced that everybody gets better off with free market solutions. But if you're trying to appeal to an electorate, this is where levelling up came in. If you're trying to appeal to an electorate that hasn't historically thought that, how do you bring them round?
Yes, because the Republicans have tried to square that circle by being protectionist and economically nationalist as well as culturally nationalist, and I suspect you would depart from that.
Oh, protectionism is a disaster.
Yeah.
Protectionism makes everybody poorer, including ultimately the industries that you're trying to protect, because they become very inefficient and ultimately go out of business. So it's very important to fight the good fight for free trade, though it's amazing how...
But not free movement, presumably.
No, not free movement. Of course not. I think you are entitled to defend your own national border. I think that's very different. I see the desiccated calculating machine approach of some economists to saying that free movement people is the other side of the coin of free trade, but I simply don't agree with that.
Right. Republicans have also become anti-interventionist in foreign policy. Again, I take it that you would disagree with that. This conference certainly does. I've been struck by the leaders how pro-Ukraine, pro-Israel everyone is. It almost seems to become an article now of conservative faith to be pro-Israel.
I think they're two different things. I'm very pro-Ukraine and I'm very pro-Israel. This is countries that have been attacked being allowed to defend themselves.
Right.
I'm very, very, very against the liberal interventionist theory that Tony Blair set out in his Chicago speech.
Okay.
I believe in sovereign nation states doing in their own borders what they choose, and that we made a terrible mistake, in retrospect, in Iraq and indeed in Afghanistan by thinking that we could bring Western democracy and capitalism to other countries. So interventionism of that kind I am strongly against, but helping countries defend themselves against an aggressor is, I think, a different matter.
I'm just aware of the time, Sir Jacob, and we should get on to slightly more personal matters. I think would be lovely for the audience, and certainly for Tim and I.
Oh, yeah.
Can we just talk? Do you imagine yourself coming back into politics? You're a star here. This is one of the biggest crowds we have seen at conference. People are genuinely standing rows deep at the back to hear you speak.
They're squeezed up against a tractor.
They are, yes. Do you want to come back into mainstream parliamentary politics?
Well, I don't think that I've entirely left politics. I am, after all, at the Tory party conference. It so much depends on what happens to the Tory party. loved being a Member of Parliament, being in the House of Commons. It was an absolute honour to represent a constituency in the House of Commons, and I felt that there was a lot that one could achieve, particularly in the party in government. We didn't achieve as much as I would have liked, but the opportunity is there. Opposition is different, and we need the Tory party to be serious again. We need the Tory party to be a party that will do conservative things. If that's what's happening, I would love to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what about you becoming a reality TV star?
You've already agreed to.
Yeah.
I've already agreed to. I can't see them at the moment. They may be.
You're being followed around by a camera.
I am. It's great fun, actually.
Right.
It's very jolly.
Is it no holds barred?
It's being done as you would expect in an entirely proper way.
Right. Are they popping out of your shower, behind your shower curtain and out of the loo and seeing you in various states? Your wife is laughing here, but I don't know how intimate it will be, Sir Jacob.
Well, I will give you one intimate insight, and that is baths, not showers. I mean, really.
I was worried about wearing brown shoes.
Really. I made absolutely clear at the very beginning that they were only ever going to see me properly dressed. There may be, whether it makes the cut or not, a shot of me where I certainly took off my coat to play cricket with Alfred. But I may well have kept my tie on. I think if I take my tie off, my head will fall off. So it's a sort of a best kept on.
It's starting to sound like Tory porn.
Can I ask why? Can I ask why you are doing it?
Yeah.
Because there's an interesting, I don't know, is there an emotional need, Sir Jacob, for you to be famous? Do you have that?
I'm not really a great one for emotional needs. I'm British. There was a wonderful interview that Petronella Wyatt did for the Telegraph many, many years ago with Willie Whitelaw. And she asked him if he ever read romantic poetry or something. And he replied, no, I'm not continental. And then corrected himself to mean sentimental. And I thought it was one of the most beautiful.
But reality television is not very conservative, or very British, maybe some would say.
Oh, I don't know. You see, I'm very against all this creeping privacy law that we've had in this country. I think once you put yourself up as a public figure, you are a public figure. And it's bad luck on your children. They're public figures to a lesser degree, but inevitably, particularly if your name's Rees-Mogg, you can't hide away in the background. And therefore, you might as well embrace it. But I worry that we have introduced judge-made law to constrict the freedom of the press. Why have we just had the Fahid scandal come out now? He's dead, so they can print what they like about him. But he used the law to stop things being printed about him consistently. There are people alive today who are doing that, and they are increasingly using privacy law rather than libel law. And this means we do not know of the scandals that are going on. And what's worse about this, with the libel law, broadly, if it were true, you could publish, if you could back it up. Now, if it's true, you've got to establish a public interest test to invade privacy. And who decides the public interest? Some judge. Well, he may not be interested at all. And why should you trust judges to determine, why should you trust the acme of the establishment to decide what we're allowed to know?
Yeah.
And the judges created all this law out of the human rights law. Parliament never dared pass a privacy law because they knew that MPs covering up for themselves would be ridiculed by voters. And so we've got this terrible judge-made law which limits the two of you. And you will know all sorts of gossip and stories, some of which you can stand up, about major public figures that you will not print because of the privacy action that would come against you. I think there's an absolute scandal of modern times. And so perhaps I go the other degree. I'm not aiming for privacy law, and you can come and see me eat my dinner.
Well, Sir Jacob, we're very grateful that you're doing a reality TV show to fight for freedom of the media. So that is
I'm a great believer in freedom of the media. Though if you say anything nasty about me, all my rights are reserved.
But speaking of judges, will you do Strictly? Can you dance?
No, of course I can't.
Can he dance?
No.
He can't dance.
No.
His wife is here for all of us.
Disco or waltz?
There's a wonderful P.G. Woodhouse called The Man with the Two Left Feet. I have always modelled myself on the man with two left feet.
What about Bake Off? No.
I think a few years ago I got asked to do Celebrity Bake Off, and I said no. because I can't cook, and I thought I'd have had to got Nanny along to do the baking. Because it has to be said, Nanny makes the most delicious sponge cakes.
But not banana loaf, because I know you have a problem with bananas.
Bananas are disgusting, yes.
Yes.
Sin against the Holy Ghost.
We're going to have to go for, this is going to go on for hours. We're going to have to go to questions from you, our wonderful audience. Let's have a couple of hands up, and let's ask Sir Jacob a couple of things that Tim and I have failed to cover. Who would like to ask a question? Be brave. Sir Jacob, you've knocked them all into total and utter silence. Here we go. Gentleman here. Fabulous. Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you very much, Sir Jacob. You mentioned there about the fact that you're doing reality TV and it's a kind of a move for freedom of the press or free media. But one of the great concerns, certainly of the Conservative Party in recent years, is that there has been a clampdown on, or not so much a clampdown, but more a restriction on free speech. I mean, most notably, there was the Online Safety Act as well that came in under Boris Johnson's government. You were a part of Boris Johnson's cabinet. You were part of that government. So how do you kind of square that circle by being this passionate defender of free speech, free media, whilst also bringing in one of the most draconian laws a Conservative government's ever brought in?
Well, I kept on trying to push back against the anti-free speech bills. As a minister, you're not always successful in what you want. It was delayed considerably. It was made much better than it was going to be. In the end, I think it was a frightful bill because it started with Theresa May. It worked through and through and through. I think it finished up with Rishi Sunak rather than with Boris. But there have been a number of these bills tried. And you realised as you went through it the unintended consequences. And you're always saying, well, you've got to protect children, which becomes the overriding argument. All these children have to be protected. Indeed, that's right. You don't want children getting bad stuff online. But equally, you've got to protect freedom of speech for adults. And the tendency of governments is one you should always be suspicious of, because governments don't want people to say rude things about them. And if they can stop it, they will.
Let me just take one of these subscribers' questions, and then we'll have another question from the audience as well. This is from Sylvia, one of our Telegraph subscribers. And she says, a nanny state is very un-British. How can Conservative MPs limit the damage Labour is currently planning with the reforms they are considering introducing? I don't believe this is what people voted for. The lack of proportionate representation in this country is a massive concern and ultimately leads to voters not being correctly represented. How can we bring about this important change, i.e., what is the role of opposition? Tim and I were talking over breakfast this morning. If you look at the events in the Middle East, suddenly, some might say, the irrelevancy of opposition becomes very painfully obvious.
Oh, well, that's absolutely true. This conference is better than 1997. I remember going to Blackpool in 1997 and going into the conference hall, and shadow ministers would stand up and they say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do the next thing. And I was sitting there thinking, no, we're not. We're out of power. We're not doing any of these things. And that is true. We can't do anything. We can't change anything. The only thing the opposition can do is oppose. And that we must do. We must be sensible about it. We shouldn't oppose things that we think will actually work, because you look silly if you do, but we should hold the government to account. On the nanny estate, the worry is we were heading in that direction too. I mean, it was Boris who tried stopping. You get constant pressure. You get the health advisors and all these people saying we shouldn't eat sweets and we shouldn't. I like Fox's Glacier fruits, if anyone wanted to know. Very delicious sweets, but you shouldn't have those, and you shouldn't have bonbons and cream buns and all of this. For your health, and they are there and they are paid and they are a quangocracy, and ministers come and go, and that's why we need fundamental reform that takes power back to ministers. On proportional representation, I fundamentally disagree. With PR, you get something nobody has voted for. With even 33% for Labour, you got what most people in the country wanted, which was to chuck out the Tories. The system worked, even if it not to our advantage.
Jacob, thank you. This is the final question here.
Gosh, what an honour. I was very interested in your prescription for the success of the party. Basically, form an alliance or unify with Reform. You know, they have 5 MPs, 4 million votes admittedly, but 5 MPs. And you don't really care. I think you actually said, you know, if that means the exit of Centre and more moderate Conservatives to the Lib Dems, well, that's just collateral damage. Given that we have 72 Lib Dem seats, the vast majority of whom came from the Conservatives, are you just happy that we waved goodbye to those particular seats? And actually, how do you respond to the observation, it's not necessarily mine, but the observation that almost we're going down a Corbynite route where we vote for ideology, which members of this party love, but actually will never get us elected?
Well,
Good question.
I'd answer that in a number of ways. First of all, if you look at where the votes went, we lost 7 million votes. 4 million went to Reform, 2.3 million stayed at home, and that leaves about 700,000 that went to Labour, the Greens and the Lib Dems combined. What happened in terms of seats is affected much more by the votes that went to Reform than by the votes that went to the Lib Dems. In some of those seats you're talking about, the 70 seats that went to Lib Dems, we only needed to win 1,000 votes back from Reform, and we won. The Lib Dem actual vote was no better than in 2019. So it's not that millions of Tories have gone off to Lib Dems. Millions of Tories went to Reform or stayed at home. A few 100,000 went to the Lib Dems, if that. So I just think your analysis doesn't work because it's based on who won seats rather than how the shares of the votes adjusted and how to win back those seats. You win them back by getting the Reform voters to vote for you rather than thinking you'll get the Lib Dems to switch to being Conservative. Now, in terms of us being, and this was absolutely true in the seats in Somerset that went to the Lib Dems, that if we'd kept the Reform vote, we would have won the seats easily. On the ideology, I'm in favour of what works. What works to make the country more successful and more prosperous. We have such a major economic problem. And it's true of the Western world, and I'd encourage people to have a look at John Moynihan's book. How have we failed to get growth? Well, the government is spending too much and taxing too much. If we carry on like that, it tips over. We simply become unable to afford to do what we want to do. We're already at 100% of GDP, debt to GDP. And that's going to carry on growing because our deficit is faster than our nominal growth rate. And that's likely to remain the case for a number of years. So we've got to make fundamental changes that will make the economy vibrant. We've got to deal with immigration because that's what our voters want to do. And the ideology is the green ideology which we must challenge, which has been fanatically absorbed by people and is making voters cold and poor. Why do we have the highest electricity prices other than Denmark or somewhere in Europe? That makes people less well off. Talk of the cost of living crisis, it's energy prices. It puts companies out of business, so they go elsewhere. Tata Steel may not have a blast furnace. We will import pure new steel from other countries that emit more, if you care about the emissions, because of a mad ideology that we are imposing a weight upon our shoulders that others don't. And we must just stop that. So I'm actually anti the green ideology, which is bankrupting us.
Who would like Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg to be the Prime Minister? Hands up. There you go. Thank you very much, Sir Jacob, for joining us on the Daily Tea Live. We'll also be having a version of this on our podcast at 5 p.m. tonight with Tim and myself. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining me on the stage. And thank you all for joining us here at the party conference in Birmingham. And thank you also for watching online from around the UK. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much.
Thank you.